The smoke was thick in the air as Kim Tae-ho crawled behind a broken concrete wall in what used to be New Seoul. The alien ships had been bombing the city for 3 days straight, and most of the buildings looked like broken teeth against the orange sky. His military uniform was torn and dirty, and his rifle only had 2 bullets left, but his dark eyes still showed no fear. He could hear them coming. The heavy footsteps of the Vortex soldiers made the ground shake under his boots. They were huge creatures, almost 8 feet tall, with thick arms and legs like tree trunks. Their skin looked like dark purple leather, and they wore shiny silver armor that seemed to glow in the dim light. Each one carried a plasma rifle that could burn through solid steel, and their helmets had red glowing visors that made them look like demons from old stories. Kim Tae-ho had been hiding in the ruins for hours after watching his entire squad get wiped out by a Vortex patrol the aliens had come from nowhere, dropping from their ships like deadly rain. His friends Park Sung-min and Lee Hyun-woo had tried to fight back, but the alien weapons were too powerful. Human bullets bounced off their armor like raindrops, while their plasma beams cut through concrete and metal as if they were paper. Now, he was alone with almost no ammunition, facing an enemy that had conquered 17 different worlds across the galaxy. The Vortex Empire was famous for being cruel and ruthless. They never took prisoners, and they never showed mercy to anyone who fought against them. Most species in the galaxy just surrendered when they saw the Vortex ships arriving, because fighting back seemed impossible. But Kim Tae-ho was not like most people. He had grown up in the mountains of Korea, where his grandfather taught him that a smart fighter could beat a strong fighter if he used his brain instead of just his muscles. His grandfather had been a soldier too during the old wars on Earth, and he always said that the enemy makes mistakes when they think they have already won. The footsteps were getting closer now, and Tae-ho could hear the aliens talking to each other in their harsh, guttural language that sounded like rocks grinding together. He peeked around the edge of his hiding spot and saw 5 Vortex soldiers moving through the rubble. They were being careful, but not too careful, because they thought all the humans in this area were already dead. The leader was even bigger than the others, with golden stripes on his armor that showed his high rank. His name was Commander Vrextal, though Tae-ho did not know this yet. The commander was scanning the area with a device that looked for heat signatures and life signs. It would find Tae-ho in about 30 seconds. Tae-ho made a quick decision. Instead of waiting to be found, he stood up from behind the wall with his hands raised in surrender. The 5 aliens immediately pointed their weapons at him and started shouting in their language. The red lights from their helmet visors made his face look like it was covered in blood. Commander Vrextal stepped forward and looked down at the small human soldier. The alien was so tall that Tae-ho barely came up to his chest. The commander tilted his massive head as if he was surprised to see a human still alive in this bombed-out wasteland. The other soldiers wanted to shoot Tae-ho right away, but their commander held up one clawed hand to stop them. He was curious about this human who did not seem afraid, even though he was completely surrounded and outgunned. Most creatures begged for their lives when they faced Vortex warriors, but this one just stood there quietly with steady breathing and calm eyes. Commander Vrextal spoke into a communication device on his wrist, and after a few minutes he got an answer back. The other soldiers looked disappointed when he told them they were taking the human prisoner instead of killing him. They had been looking forward to target practice, but orders were orders in the Vortex military. 2 of the soldiers moved forward and put energy restraints around Tae-ho's wrists. The metal bands hummed with power and would give him a painful electric shock if he tried to break free or run away. The restraints also had tracking devices so the aliens could find him anywhere he went. As they marched him through the destroyed streets toward their landing zone, Tae-ho kept his eyes open and his mind working. He noticed everything about his captors: the way they moved, the sounds their equipment made, and especially the small devices attached to their armor that seemed to control their weapons and communication systems. The aliens talked among themselves as they walked, thinking the human could not understand them, but Tae-ho had been studying alien languages for years as part of his military training. He caught some words here and there, enough to know they were taking him to their main ship for questioning. When they reached the landing zone, Tae-ho saw the Vortex transport ship up close for the first time. It was a massive black vessel covered in sharp angles and glowing lines of energy. The hull looked like it was made from some kind of metal that absorbed light, making it seem like a hole in the sky. The ship had weapons mounted all over its surface, and Tejo could see smaller fighter craft docked in bays along the sides. Everything about it was designed to look frightening and powerful, which worked very well on most species, but Tejo was more interested in the technical details than the intimidation factor. As they forced him up the loading ramp into the ship's belly, he noticed the way the doors opened with a soft hissing sound and how the lights inside pulsed. In a steady rhythm, he saw control panels covered with symbols he did not recognize, but the layout seemed logical and organized. The interior of the ship was clean and sterile, with walls that curved in smooth lines and floors that felt soft under his boots. The aliens pushed him down a long corridor past rooms filled with equipment and other soldiers. All of the Vorthek they passed stopped what they were doing to stare at the human prisoner. Some of them had never seen a human before, and they were surprised by how small and fragile he looked compared to their own massive bodies. They wondered why their commander had bothered to capture such a weak creature instead of just shooting it and moving on to more important tasks. But Commander Vrextal had his reasons. The Vorthak High Command wanted to learn more about human military tactics and technology before they finished conquering Earth. They had been surprised by how hard the humans fought, even though their weapons were primitive. Compared to Vorthak plasma rifles, the humans had also shown some clever strategies that the aliens had not expected. Most species fought in predictable ways, using the same basic tactics over and over again, but humans seemed to come up with new ideas in the middle of battle, adapting to situations as they changed. This made some of the Vorthak generals nervous because their empire was built on being able to predict and control everything. If humans could think of new ways to fight, it might take longer to conquer their planet and cost more Vorthak lives than planned. As they reached the detention area of the ship, Tejo was still observing everything around him, the walls, the ceiling, the way the alien technology worked together. He was like a student taking notes on the most important test of his life, except this test would determine whether humanity lived or died. The energy restraints on his wrists felt heavy, but his mind was light and quick. He had already started forming a plan, though he did not know yet if it would work. The aliens thought they had captured a helpless human soldier, but they had actually caught something much more dangerous. They had caught someone who refused to give up. The detention cell was a small metal box with no windows and only one dim light in the ceiling. Kim Tae-ho sat on the hard bench that was built into the wall and waited. He had been in the cell for several hours, but he did not feel scared or hopeless. Instead, he felt excited because every minute he spent on this ship was another minute to learn about Vorthak technology. The door suddenly opened with a loud hiss, and 3 aliens walked in. The first one was Commander Vrextal, who had captured him. The second was a Vorthak wearing white robes instead of armor, which meant he was probably a scientist or doctor. The third alien was different from the others. He was taller and had gold markings all over his dark purple skin. His armor was more decorated, and he moved like someone who was used to being in charge. This was Captain Zordek, the commander of the entire ship, though Tejo did not know his name, yet the captain looked down at the human prisoner with yellow eyes that showed no emotion at all. He had seen thousands of prisoners from dozens of different worlds, and they all looked the same to him after a while. Just another weak creature that would break under questioning. The scientist stepped forward carrying a strange device that looked like a metal helmet with wires and glowing crystals attached to it. This was a neural extractor, the most advanced interrogation tool in the Vorthak Empire. It could read memories directly from a prisoner's brain and pull out every secret they had ever known. Most aliens were terrified when they saw the neural extractor because they knew what it could do. It did not just read your thoughts, it could also cause incredible pain. While it worked, many prisoners went insane before the machine was finished with them. The few who survived usually could not remember their own names afterward, but Kim Tae-ho looked at the device with curiosity instead of fear. He had heard rumors about Vorthak mind-reading technology during his military briefings, but he had never seen one up close. The machine was obviously very advanced, but it was still just a computer, and computers could be hacked. If you knew how the aliens grabbed his arms and forced him out of the cell, they marched him down another long corridor to a room that looked like a medical laboratory. The walls were covered with screens showing alien writing and diagrams that made no sense to human eyes. In the center of the room was a metal chair with straps and wires connected to a massive computer that filled half the wall. They strapped Taeho into the chair so tightly that he could barely move. The metal straps were cold against his skin, and they dug into his wrists and ankles. The scientist began attaching electrodes to his head while Captain Zordek watched from across the room. The captain had his arms crossed, and he looked bored, as if this was just routine business for him. Commander Vrexthal stood beside the captain and explained what they wanted to know from the human prisoner. They needed information about Earth military bases and weapon systems. They also wanted to understand human battle tactics and how the resistance fighters were organized. All of this information would help them finish conquering the planet faster. The scientist finished preparing the machine and stepped back to a control panel. The neural extractor began to hum with power, and the crystals started glowing brighter. The sound got louder and louder until it filled the entire room. Captain Zordek smiled coldly because he knew that in a few minutes they would know everything the human had ever learned. But Captain Zordek did not understand something very important about humans. Unlike most other species, humans had developed their brains differently over millions of years. They were not the strongest or fastest creatures in the galaxy, but they were the best at solving problems and adapting to new situations. Kim Taeho had spent years training in cyber warfare. As part of his military service, he knew how to break into computer systems and how to protect his own mind from electronic attacks. The Vorthic neural extractor was more advanced than anything humans had built, but it worked on the same basic principles as human technology. As the machine connected to his brain, Taeho felt a strange, tingling sensation in his head. The alien device was trying to read his memories, but instead of fighting it, he relaxed and let it make the connection. The Vorthic scientists had designed their machine to work in only one direction. They never imagined that a prisoner might try to use the connection to hack back into their systems. The neural link worked both ways, like a bridge between two computers. While the machine tried to download information from Taeho's brain, he was uploading his consciousness into their network. He moved through their data files like a ghost, learning their security codes and mapping their computer systems. Captain Zordek was still watching with that bored expression when the first alarm started beeping. It was a small sound at first, just one warning light on the control panel, but then more alarms joined it, and the lights began flashing faster. The scientist looked confused and started pressing buttons, trying to figure out what was wrong. Taeho closed his eyes and concentrated harder. He had found the ship's main computer and was learning how to control it. The Vorthak had built their technology to be very secure, but they had made one huge mistake. They had never considered that someone might attack them from inside their own systems. Through the neural link, he could see the entire structure of their network. It was like looking at a map of a huge building with millions of rooms. The Vorthik had organized everything in a very logical way, which made it easier for him to understand how it all worked. Together, each ship in their fleet was connected to every other ship, and they all shared the same basic programming. This was perfect for Taeho, because it meant that once he learned how to control one ship, he could potentially control all of them. The aliens had built their empire to be efficient and coordinated, but they had also made it vulnerable to someone who could find the right weakness. More alarms started going off, and the lights in the room began flickering. Captain Zordek was not bored anymore. He was staring at the control panels with worry in his yellow eyes. The scientist was frantically trying to shut down the neural extractor, but the machine would not respond to his commands. Taeho opened his eyes and looked directly at Captain Zordek. The human was still strapped to the chair, but somehow he did not look like a prisoner anymore. He looked like someone who was in control of the situation. The captain took a step backward without realizing it, because there was something in the human's eyes that made him feel afraid for the first time in his long military career. Captain Zordek began to wonder if capturing this human had been a terrible mistake. The alarms were getting louder and more warning lights were flashing. The ship computer was starting to malfunction in ways that should have been impossible. Kim Taeho smiled at the alien captain and spoke in a calm, quiet voice that somehow carried over all the noise in the room. He told them that they had made a very big error. They had connected their most advanced technology to someone who had spent his whole life learning how to break into computer systems. The interrogation had lasted exactly 8 minutes. The red warning lights bathed the entire command bridge in bloody color as Captain Zordek ran from the interrogation room. His heavy boots crashed against the metal floor, while behind him the alarm screamed louder and louder the other Vorthek. Officers on the bridge looked up in confusion as their captain burst through the doors with panic in his yellow eyes. Something impossible was happening to their ship. The lights were flickering on and off, the artificial gravity was fluctuating, and the main computer was refusing to follow orders. Half of the control panels showed error messages in bright red letters, while the other half displayed information that made no sense at all. Lieutenant Kexmore, the ship's second-in-command, approached. The captain, with worry written across his purple face, he reported that they were losing control of basic ship functions. The weapons systems were offline, the shields were dropping, and the navigation computer was giving them coordinates for empty space instead of Earth. Captain Zordek stared at the main viewing screen, which normally showed a clear image of the planet they were orbiting. Now it was filled with static and strange symbols that hurt to look at. He had commanded warships for over 30 years and had conquered 12 different worlds, but he had never seen anything like this down. In the interrogation room, Kim Tae-ho was still strapped to the chair, but his mind was free and racing through the ship's computer network. Like lightning, the neural extractor that was supposed to break his will had instead given him access to everything the Vorthek had built over centuries of conquest. Through the digital connection, he could see not just this one ship, but the entire Vorthak fleet. The aliens had linked all their vessels together through quantum communication networks that allowed them to coordinate attacks across vast distances. What they had not realized was that this same network could be used against them. Tae-ho discovered something that made him almost laugh out loud. Despite his dangerous situation, the mighty Vorthak Empire that had terrorized the galaxy for 1,000 years had a fatal weakness. They were too organized for their own good. Every ship in their fleet used exactly the same computer systems. Every weapon had identical programming. Every soldier followed the same training protocols. They had created perfect uniformity across their entire civilization, which made them incredibly efficient at conquest, but also incredibly vulnerable to someone who understood their patterns. It was like finding out that every lock in a huge building used the same key. Once you had that key, you could open any door you wanted, and Kim Tae-ho now had the master key to the entire Vorthek Empire. He began sending new commands through the quantum network, but he was very careful about how he did it. The aliens would notice if he tried to shut down everything at once. Instead, he made small changes that looked like normal system updates. He altered security protocols, modified weapon targeting systems, and planted virus programs that would activate later. The Vorthag had another weakness that Tae-ho could exploit. Their society was built on a rigid military hierarchy where questioning orders was punishable by death. Lower ranking soldiers never argued with their superiors, even when the orders seemed strange. This blind obedience had made them powerful conquerors, but it also made them easy to fool. Through the ship's communication system, Tae-ho began broadcasting new orders using the proper authorization codes that he had stolen from their computer. He told weapon operators to change their targeting parameters. He instructed shield technicians to modify their defense protocols. He gave navigation officers new patrol routes that would take them away from Earth. All of these orders came with the correct command signatures, so the Vorthik soldiers followed them without question. They had been trained never to think for themselves, only to obey, and now that training was being used against them, Captain Zordek was still trying to regain control of his ship when he received an urgent message from the fleet commander, Admiral Thoxran. The admiral was shouting in the harsh Vorthek language, demanding to know why Zordek's ship was transmitting override codes to the entire invasion force. The captain looked around his bridge in growing horror. He could see his communications. HFY Air frantically working at his station, but the alien soldier insisted he was not sending any messages. The ship computer was acting on its own broadcasting commands that none of them had authorized on other ships throughout the fleet. Similar scenes were playing out. Weapon systems that had been aimed at Earth were slowly turning toward empty space. Shield generators were powering down for what appeared to be routine maintenance. Navigation computers were plotting courses away from the Human homeworld, the fleet officers tried to countermand these orders, but their own computer systems told them the commands were legitimate. They came from proper authority channels with all the correct security codes. How could they argue with their own technology? Admiral Thoxran watched from his flagship as the perfect formation of his invasion fleet began to fall apart. Ships were drifting out of position, weapons were pointing in wrong directions, and his communication network was filled with conflicting orders that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He had led the conquest of 16 worlds and had never seen anything like this. His ships were betraying him, but he could not understand how or why. The human planet below them had no technology advanced enough to cause this kind of chaos. Their primitive radio signals could barely reach beyond their own moon. What the Admiral did not know was that the answer to his problem was still strapped to a chair in Captain Zordek's interrogation room. Kim Tae-ho had spent the last few minutes learning everything there was to know about Vorthak military doctrine, and now he was using that knowledge to tear their invasion apart from the inside. The neural extractor had given him access to classified battle plans, strategic databases, and most importantly, the psychological profiles of every high-ranking Vorthak officer. He knew which commanders were overly cautious, which ones were aggressive, and which ones could be tricked into making mistakes. Through the quantum network, he began sending personalized orders to different ships. Each message was crafted to exploit the specific weaknesses of whoever received it. He told cautious commanders to retreat to safer positions. He ordered aggressive captains to attack targets that did not exist. He gave conflicting instructions to officers who were known to argue with each other. The result was beautiful chaos. The Vorthak fleet that had arrived at Earth as a coordinated fighting force was now scattered and confused. Ships were flying in random directions, weapons were firing at shadows, and the chain of command was completely broken. Captain Zordek finally realized what was happening when he received a message on his personal communication device. The message was in perfect Korean, which should have been impossible since no Vorthak had ever learned human languages. The message was from Kim Tae-ho, and it was very simple. It said that the interrogation was over and now it was time for the Vorthak to answer some questions. Across the massive Vorthak fleet orbiting Earth, the impossible was becoming reality. Ships that had blockaded planets and destroyed civilizations for centuries were now turning their weapons on each other. The quantum communication network that had been the Empire's greatest strength was carrying a virus that no Vorthak scientist had ever imagined. Admiral Thoxran stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching his perfect invasion force tear itself apart. The main viewing screen showed dozens of his ships firing plasma beams at empty space, while others had begun moving away from Earth entirely. His communications officer reported that every ship in the fleet was receiving different orders, and all of them claimed to be authentic. The Admiral had conquered 16 worlds using overwhelming firepower and perfect coordination. Now his own ships were more dangerous to each other than the primitive humans below. His face turned darker purple with rage as he realized that somehow a single human prisoner had done what entire alien civilizations had failed to accomplish. On the surface of Earth, Lieutenant Park Ji-woo crouched behind the wreckage of a destroyed tank and watched the alien ships through her binoculars. The Vorthak vessels that had been raining death from the sky for 3 days were now flying in chaotic patterns. Some were shooting at nothing, while others seemed to be leaving the area entirely. She activated her radio and called to the other human resistance fighters scattered throughout the ruins of New Seoul. Her voice was excited as she reported that the alien fleet was destroying itself. Nobody knew why, but ships were exploding in bright flashes of light high above the city. Sergeant Lee Min-ho heard the radio message from his position in the mountains outside the city. He had been preparing for one final hopeless attack against the Vorthak ground forces when the enemy drop ships suddenly began crashing into the ocean. The massive alien transports that had been landing fresh troops every hour were now falling from the sky like broken birds. The Vorthak soldiers on the ground were just as confused as their officers in space. They had been receiving contradictory orders through their helmet communication systems. Some commands told them to advance, while others ordered immediate retreat. Some messages instructed them to attack human positions that did not exist, while others sent them Marching toward empty fields, Commander Vrextal, who had captured Kim Tae-ho, tried desperately to contact his ship for new orders, but the only response he got was static mixed with what sounded like human music. The disciplined Vorthak military structure was collapsing as soldiers received commands. That made no sense from officers who claimed they had never given those orders, but Kim Tae-ho was not finished with just disrupting the Earth invasion fleet. Through the quantum network, he had discovered that every Vorthak ship in the galaxy was connected to the same central command system. The neural extractor had given him access to communication channels that reached across 17 star systems to every conquered world in their empire. His fingers moved through the digital pathways. Like a pianist playing a deadly song, each command he sent was carefully crafted to cause maximum chaos while appearing to be legitimate military orders. He began broadcasting liberation codes to worlds that had been enslaved for generations on the planet Altair 7. The blue-skinned Altarians had lived under Vorthak occupation for 50 years. The orbital defense platforms that kept them trapped on their homeworld suddenly powered down as automated systems received new instructions. The massive plasma cannons that could destroy any ship trying to escape turned toward empty space and began firing at nothing. The Altarian resistance leader Velenth could not believe what he was seeing through his telescope. The prison satellites that had orbited their world for decades were shutting down one by one. Their energy shields flickered and died, leaving them vulnerable for the first time since the conquest. Similar scenes were playing out across the galaxy on the crystal world of Nexus Prime. The reptilian Nexari watched their guard towers explode as automated defense systems turned on their own installations. The Vorthak had programmed their machines to follow orders without question, and now those same machines were following new orders from an unexpected source. Kim Tae-ho found the central database that contained information about every conquered species in the Empire. The Vorthak kept detailed records of how they had defeated each civilization and what methods they used to keep them enslaved. This information was meant to help them maintain control, but now it became a weapon for liberation. He began sending specific instructions to each world tailored to their unique situations. The Altarians received codes that would shut down their orbital defense grid. The Nexari got programs that would overload their guard tower systems. The crystalline beings of Andromeda Station were given access to their own communication networks for the first time in centuries. Each liberation was timed perfectly to happen simultaneously across all 17 star systems. The Vorthak Empire had spent 1,000 years building a perfectly coordinated military machine, but that same coordination meant that when one part failed, everything else would follow. On his flagship, Admiral Foxran received reports from across the galaxy that made his blood run cold. Every conquered world was reporting the same impossible situation. Their defense systems were failing. Their communication networks were compromised, and their automated weapons were attacking Vorthak installations. The Admiral had risen through the ranks by being ruthless and efficient, but he had never faced an enemy like this. How could one primitive human affect systems that were light years away? The quantum network was supposed to be unhackable, protected by encryption that would take alien supercomputers millions of years to break. What the Admiral did not understand was that Kim Tae-ho had not broken their encryption. He had simply convinced their own systems that he was authorized to use it. The neural extractor had given him access to the highest level command codes in the Empire, and now he was using those codes to give the Vorthak military exactly what it was programmed to do: follow orders without question. Captain Zordek burst onto Admiral Foxran's bridge with desperation in his yellow eyes. He reported that the human prisoner was somehow still connected to their ship's computer through the neural extractor, and they could not shut the machine off every time they tried to disconnect it. The system told them that an interrogation was in progress and could not be interrupted. The Admiral ordered his best technicians to cut the power to the entire interrogation room, but even that did not work. The neural extractor had its own backup power supply and safety protocols that prevented it from being shut down during an active session. The Vorthak had built their technology too well across the Empire. Resistance fighters who had given up hope began to realize that something miraculous was happening. The prison camps that had held them for generations were opening as automated security systems received new instructions. Guard robots that had kept them enslaved began attacking their Vorthak overseers instead. On 17 different worlds, the sound of freedom rang out as enslaved species took their first breaths of free air in decades. They did not know who had given them this chance, but they were not going to waste it. Alien resistance fighters who had been hiding in caves and ruins emerged to reclaim their homeworld. Vorthak empire that had seemed unbeatable just hours before was crumbling. Like a house of cards, each new liberation created more chaos, which led to more confusion, which caused more systems to fail. The perfectly organized military machine was destroying itself from the inside, and in a small interrogation room on Captain Zordek's ship Kim, Taeho smiled as he watched the galaxy change through the eyes of 1,000 different computer systems. The Vorthak had made one final mistake. When they tried to read his mind, they had given him the keys to their entire civilization. On the distant world of Kepler 442b, the Zephyrian people had not seen their own sky for over 200 years. The Vorthak had built a massive energy dome over their entire planet that blocked out the stars and kept them trapped in eternal twilight. But now cracks of real sunlight were breaking through as the dome generators received shutdown commands from across the galaxy. Elder Zix Era, the oldest surviving member of her species, stood in the central plaza of their underground city and watched. The impossible happened. The energy barriers that had imprisoned her people since before she was born were flickering and failing. Vorthak guard drones that had patrolled their tunnels for generations suddenly turned and began attacking the occupation force. Instead, she pressed her clawed hand against the smooth crystal that served as their communication device and sent a message to every Zephyrian settlement across the planet. The liberation codes were spreading through their own hidden networks, now allowing them to reclaim technology that had been locked away for centuries. Similar scenes of joy and disbelief were happening simultaneously on 16 other worlds. The Vorthak Empire had been so confident in their control systems that they had never imagined someone could use those same systems against them. But Kim Tae-ho had done more than just hack their computers. He had given every enslaved species the tools to free themselves. On the water world of Oceania, the amphibious Aquari had been forced to live in underwater camps while the Vorthak harvested their planet's rare crystals. The mining stations that had poisoned their seas for decades suddenly went silent as automated systems shut down the extraction equipment. The toxic waste that had been pumping into their oceans stopped flowing for the first time in 50 years. Captain Reefsinger, the leader of the Aquari resistance, dove deep into the darkest trenches where her people had been hiding. She carried with her a communication device that was receiving strange signals from space. The signals contained access codes that unlocked every Vorthak facility on their world. The Aquari warriors who had been planning suicide attacks against impossible odds suddenly found themselves swimming through unlocked doors and past deactivated security systems. The Vorthak guards, who had seemed invincible, were now trapped in their own bases as the computer systems turned against them. Back on Earth, the human resistance fighters were witnessing the collapse of the occupation force. Lieutenant Park Jiwoo led a squad of soldiers through the streets of New Seoul and found Vorthak dropships landing everywhere, but instead of bringing reinforcements, the ships were evacuating confused aliens who could no longer contact their command structure. The massive alien walkers that had terrorized the city were now standing motionless in the middle of streets. Their pilots had abandoned them after receiving orders to retreat that seemed to come from 3 different sources at the same time. Some orders told them to defend their positions, others commanded immediate withdrawal, and a few instructed them to attack their own ally. Sergeant Lee Min-ho climbed to the top of a ruined skyscraper and used his radio to coordinate with resistance cells across the planet. The reports he received all told the same incredible story. Vorthak forces everywhere were either retreating or fighting each other while their technology malfunctioned in ways that benefited the humans. In the mountain caves where human survivors had been hiding, families emerged to see sunlight for the first time in days. The alien bombardment had stopped, and the terrifying sound A Vorthak ship screaming overhead had been replaced by a strange quiet that felt almost peaceful, but the most amazing transformations were happening on worlds where the Vorthak had ruled for centuries. The crystalline beings of Sigma Draconis had been used as living computers, their natural ability to process information exploited by their conquerors. Now, the neural interface devices that had enslaved their minds were broadcasting liberation codes instead of control signals. The crystal entities began connecting to each other across their homeworld, sharing the access codes that Kim Tae-ho had discovered. Their collective intelligence grew stronger with each new connection, and soon they were helping to spread the revolution to other star systems using communication methods the Vorthak had never understood. On the desert world of Arid 9, the nomadic sandwalker tribes had been forced to work in Vorthak mining colonies that stripped their planet of precious metals. The environmental controls that regulated the harsh desert climate suddenly began working in favor of the enslaved workers instead of their captors. Sandstorms that had been artificially suppressed for decades were now being generated by the weather control systems. The storms blinded the Vorthak guards and provided perfect cover for the Sandwalker warriors to reclaim their ancestral territories. The mining equipment that had scarred their landscape began breaking down as maintenance robots received new programming. Tribe leader Dunrunner had spent 30 years planning a hopeless rebellion against the occupation force. Now he found himself leading thousands of freed Sandwalkers across the desert toward mining facilities that were surrendering without a fight. The Vorthak soldiers inside were receiving evacuation orders that they could not verify but dared not ignore. The liberation was spreading faster than anyone had imagined. Each newly freed world contributed its own knowledge and resources to help liberate others. The galaxy-wide quantum network that had been the Vorthak Empire's greatest achievement was now carrying the seeds of its own destruction. On the gas giant Europa 7, the floating cities of the Skyborn people had been converted into processing plants for rare atmospheric gases. The anti-gravity generators that kept their cities aloft suddenly began working at full power for the first time in generations, allowing the Skyborn to reach altitudes that had been forbidden for decades. Windrider, the youngest member of the Skyborn Council, soared through the upper atmosphere and felt the joy of unlimited flight for the first time in her life. The energy barriers that had kept her people trapped in the lower cloud layers were gone, and the sky was truly theirs again. She sang the ancient songs of her people as she flew, and her voice was carried by the wind to every floating city on the planet. The songs told of a time when the Skyborn had been free to dance with the storms and ride the hurricane winds. Now that time had returned thanks to a human warrior they would never meeting. The Vorthak command centers on every conquered world. Panic was spreading as fast as the liberation. The rigid military hierarchy that had kept the Empire together for 1,000 years was collapsing as officers received contradictory orders from sources they could not identify. Some Vorthak commanders tried to shut down their communication systems entirely, but that only made things worse. Their own soldiers began to assume that the silence meant they should follow the last orders they had received, which were usually the liberation codes that Kim Tae-ho had planted in their networks. Admiral Thoxran sat on his flagship bridge and watched his empire die before his eyes. Every report from every world told the same story: complete system failure, coordinated rebellion, and the impossible collapse of technology that had never failed before his perfect conquest. Machine had become a perfect liberation machine. He finally understood what was happening when he received a personal message on his most secure communication channel. The message was in perfect Vorthak language, but it came from the human prisoner on Captain Zoradek's ship. The message was simple and devastating. It explained that the Vorthak had spent so long being conquerors that they had forgotten how to imagine defeat. They had built their empire to be efficient and coordinated, but they had also made it vulnerable to anyone who could understand their patterns. Kim Tae-ho had not just hacked their computers, he had hacked their entire way of thinking. 8 minutes and 17 seconds had passed since the neural extractor first connected to Kim Tae-ho brain, and in that brief time the most powerful empire in galactic history had fallen. The Vorthak, who had ruled over 17 star systems for 1,000 years, were now scattered refugees fleeing from worlds they had once controlled with absolute authority. And The interrogation room aboard Captain Zordek's ship, the energy restraints that had held the human prisoner suddenly released. With a soft click, the neural extractor finally shut down as its safety protocols decided that the session had lasted long enough. Kim Tae-ho stood up from the metal chair, slowly stretching muscles that had been motionless during his digital battle. Across the galaxy, Captain Zordek entered the room with his shoulders slumped in defeat. The proud alien warrior who had conquered 12 worlds looked like a broken old man. His yellow eyes showed confusion and something that might have been respect. As he stared at the small human who had destroyed everything he had spent his life building, the captain asked the question that was burning in his mind. How had one primitive human accomplished what entire civilizations had failed to do in centuries? Of warfare, how had a species that had not even reached the stars managed to bring down an empire that spanned the galaxy? Kim Tae-ho looked at the defeated alien commander and gave him an answer that was both simple and profound. The Vorthak had spent so long being superior that they had forgotten to imagine what it would be like to face someone different. They had conquered species that were stronger, faster, and more numerous than humans, but they had never fought anyone who thought the way human beings had evolved on a dangerous world where survival meant adapting to constant change. They had learned to see patterns where others saw chaos and to find opportunities where others saw only problems. The Vorthak had built their empire on predictable rules and rigid systems, but humans specialized in breaking rules and changing systems. The neural extractor had been designed to read the memories of aliens who thought like the Vorthak in straight lines and logical patterns, but human brains were different. They made connections that seemed impossible and found solutions that defied conventional wisdom. When the machine tried to download human thoughts, it had encountered something it was never designed to handle. Captain Zordek nodded slowly as he began to understand. The Vorthak had created the perfect empire for controlling predictable enemies, but they had made themselves vulnerable to someone who could think in unpredictable ways. They had been so successful for so long that they had stopped preparing for the impossible. Kim Tae-ho walked past the captain and out of the interrogation room. The ship around him was in chaos as Vorthak crew members ran through the corridors trying to regain control of their own vessel. But their technology was still following the new programming he had installed, and every system on the ship now served human interests. Instead of alien ones, he made his way to the communication center where he sent a message to Earth using the ship's quantum transmitters. The message reached Lieutenant Park Ji-woo, who was coordinating the human resistance from her position in New Seoul. She could hardly believe the voice she heard speaking Korean through the alien communication device. Kim Tae-ho told her that the immediate threat to Earth was over, but that their work was just beginning. The Vorthak Empire had collapsed, but 17 star systems full of newly freed species would need help rebuilding their civilizations. Many of them had been enslaved for so long that they had forgotten how to govern themselves. Over the following months, human ships began arriving at worlds across the galaxy, but they did not come as conquerors. They came as teachers and advisors, helping the liberated species learn how to use their freedom. The humans shared their knowledge of democracy, cooperation, and peaceful conflict resolution on Altair 7. The blue-skinned Altarians worked with human engineers to dismantle the orbital weapons platforms that had kept them imprisoned. The technology was repurposed to build communication satellites that would help the Altarians reconnect with their scattered colonies. The crystalline beings of Sigma Draconis used their natural computing abilities to help design new government systems for worlds that had been ruled by military force for centuries. Their collective intelligence combined with human creativity to solve problems that neither species could have handled alone. On the water world of Oceania, human marine biologists worked with the Aquari to clean up the environmental damage caused by centuries of strip mining. The toxic waste that had poisoned their seas was neutralized using techniques that combined human chemistry with Aquari knowledge of ocean ecosystems. The former Vorthak territories became a coalition of free worlds united not by conquest but by mutual cooperation. Each species contributed their unique abilities to help others while learning from the knowledge and experience of their neighbors. The galaxy had never seen anything like this voluntary alliance between such different civilization's Kim Tae-ho found himself appointed as the first human ambassador to the Galactic Liberation Council. The position was created specifically for him by unanimous vote of all 17 liberated worlds. They wanted the person who had given them their freedom to help them decide how to use it, but he was not the only human taking on important roles. Lieutenant Park Ji-woo became the director of the Interspecies Communication Project, helping different alien cultures learn to understand each other. Sergeant Lee Min-ho led the Galactic Peacekeeping Force, which was made up of volunteers from every liberated world. Captain Zorthek surprised everyone by requesting permission to join the human diplomatic corps. He had spent his life as a conqueror, but he wanted to spend the rest of it helping to build something better. The former Vorthik officer became an expert on transitional government, helping former military dictatorships learn how to become peaceful democracies. The few Vorthak who had survived the collapse of their empire were given the choice of exile or rehabilitation. Most chose rehabilitation and slowly learned to live in a galaxy where strength came from cooperation instead of domination. Some even became valuable contributors to the new galactic community. Years later, Kim Tae-ho returned to Earth and the rebuilt city of New Seoul. He walked through the memorial park that had been created where the final battle against the Vorthak had taken place. The monument at the center was not dedicated to any single hero, but to the human capacity for turning any situation into an opportunity for freedom. Children from dozens of different alien species played together in the park while their parents conducted business in the nearby Galactic Trade Center. Earth had become the unofficial capital of the new galaxy, not because humans had conquered it, but because they had shown everyone what was possible when different cultures worked together. Kim Tae-ho sat on a bench and watched the children play. He thought about that day in the interrogation room when he had faced a choice between giving up and finding a way to fight back. The Vorthak had thought they were interrogating a prisoner, but they had actually given him the chance to show the galaxy what humans were truly capable of. The neural extractor had been designed to break minds, but instead it had freed them. The machine that was meant to extract secrets had instead extracted hope and spread it across